Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Prakash Loungani. I'm the program director for the MS in Applied Economics at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to the second in our series of webinars called Engaging Economics. Today's topic is, what grade does the Fed deserve? This is being recorded, as Peter just said, and it's going to be required viewing for all my macro students, as well as the students in my economic growth class. You will see that you have to view this and give your opinion of which panelist did the best. So you have to give a grade to each panelist. Okay, that's your assignment. So you have to pay close attention to what each and every one of them is saying, and feel free to put questions in the chat. Okay. So with that, let me just introduce our panelists. Mark Zandi is the chief economist of Moody's, and over the course of this year, as you do macro and economic growth with me, you will see clips of him on CNN, Bloomberg, and many other places, as well as read some of his op-eds. Marvin Barth is an old buddy of mine from Fed days. I was there in the 90s, Marvin, so I'm assuming you were.
I actually took over your job as you left, if you recall.
Oh, you had big shoes to fill, as they say.
Absolutely. They were enormous.
Okay.
Could never live up to it.
Okay. All right. So Marvin and I guess, almost, but didn't fully interact at the Fed. Since then, Marvin has had trouble holding down a job. He's been at the Treasury, at the BIS, and in many other places. And now he runs thematic markets, which, again, to my students, I'm going to send you the link so that you can subscribe to it for fresh contrarian thinking on all the economic matters that we are discussing in class. Okay. And Jonathan Wright is a professor of economics in the Johns Hopkins Economics Department in Baltimore. He's also, as I was telling the other people, in a sense, my boss. He's the program chair of the Masters in Applied Economics program. So if you have any complaints about me, you have to write to Jonathan. Right. And then, of course, all of you know who is the director of our new Master of Science in Financial Economics, very popular program already. Okay. Tara Sinclair is the chair of the economics department at George Washington University. And she and I also go way back as fellow forecasters. She used to be the director of the forecasting center at GW. So I know her from those days. She recently did a stint at Treasury and is just back in academia. So welcome back to academia. Good to have you back.
Good to be back.
Yeah. And have you in a setting where you can speak your mind now. Yeah, okay. Let me just do a check with my wife. Am I sounding okay? You keep looking okay. All right. Okay. All right. So we're going to start. I couldn't think of what order to have panelists in, so I actually asked ChatGPT. And the order that was suggested was Zandi, then Marvin Barth, then Jonathan Wright, and then Tara Sinclair. I gave them some information about each person, and they said that to heighten the contrast in views, you should have Zandi followed by Barth. And then since Jonathan Wright and Tara Sinclair are both forecasting experts, maybe you should group them together. So that was ChatGPT's answer.
Huh.
We'll see if it works out.
Well,
if
Prakash, with the last name Zandi, I've never been first in my life, but I'll take it. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mark, thanks very much for making the time for this. Our students really appreciate it. And as I said, it becomes an integral part of what I teach in my macro and economic growth classes. So the webinar poses a question, what should the Fed do? So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 uninterrupted minutes to tell me what what grade does the Fed deserve? And we are thinking about the Fed's performance over the past year, but if it's necessary for you to go back further, then of course, you should feel free to do so. So it's up to you now. What grade does the Fed deserve?
Prakash, it's good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's good to be with the other panelists. Real honor. I would give, let me preface this by saying I'm focused on monetary policy, Fed policy since the beginning of the year. And since the beginning of the year, the Fed has done absolutely nothing with regard to monetary policy. Interest rates have remained unchanged. The federal funds rate target is 4.25 to 4.5%, and it has not budged from that over that period. And I think that's the appropriate policy for given the circumstances. And I would give the Fed a strong A for not doing anything but just sitting on its hands. And I think the logic for sitting on it, the Fed sitting on its hands is simply that economic policy more broadly, fiscal policy, trade policy, immigration policy has been so uncertain since the beginning of the year. It's up, down, all around. I think the Fed is in the right to wait and see how that plays out, where that policy takes us and where it lands, and before it makes a move. Now, it's meeting this week, as you know, and will likely begin to cut interest rates on Wednesday. And, I'll talk about that in a second. I think that also makes sense if they actually follow through. But the other thing to consider is not only the uncertainty around the economic policy as a reason for doing nothing, it's the policies themselves. They work at cross purposes from the Fed's perspective, and their dual mandate of full employment and low and stable inflation. The trade policy, the higher tariffs, they work to raise inflation and weaken economic growth. And, we're seeing that, quite clearly now. Both are happening. Inflation's picking up. It's well above the Fed's target, and the direction of travel is uncomfortable. It's accelerating and will continue to do so. And of course, growth has slowed very sharply so far this year, most evident in the job market. Job growth over the last few months has been, well, there's been no job growth. The job market has come to a complete standstill. So with that, the Fed's in a quandary. What do they do? Do they respond to the higher inflation, or do they respond to the weaker growth? That implies different policy steps. And because you can't figure that out, it goes right back to doing nothing, sitting on your hands. The other policy I'll call out with the same kind of implications is highly restrictive immigration policy, which began a little over a year ago when Biden implemented an executive order making it more difficult for asylum seekers to come across the southern border. And of course, President Trump has tripled down on that policy. And that also, at least in the near term, raises inflation and weakens economic growth. And again, you can see it in both the inflation numbers and the labor market statistics. The fact that labor force growth has come to a standstill, and the labor supply has been impaired. So those policies make it very difficult for the Fed to respond. What do? Do they respond to the higher inflation, which would imply at the very least no reduction in rates and perhaps even an increase in rates? Or do they respond to the weaker economic growth, and that would imply lower rates? So, the net of all that is very difficult to figure out. Therefore, do nothing. I'll say one last thing, and then I'll stop. My grade of an A does depend on, to some degree, whether they actually do cut interest rates when they announce their decision on Wednesday. The markets, investors are fully pricing in a 25 basis point cut, and I think that's appropriate. And if the Fed follows through, then I think they will hold on to that A, because I do think at this point the growth, the impact on growth is now threatening a recession, and I think the Fed should avoid that at all costs. Not only because obviously recession is going to mean a lot of financial and economic pain and suffering for Americans, but also in the context of Fed independence. The Fed will get blamed for the recession, and the independence of the Federal Reserve will come under increasing pressure, already is, and that would intensify that pressure in an untoward way. So I think they've done just exactly the right thing so far this year, assuming that they cut rates on Wednesday tomorrow. They'll continue to get that A for their policies. I think they've done a good job.
Okay, thanks, Mark. My students would be happy that you have given the Fed a clear grade and not made them put your remarks into Chat GPT and figure out what grade you had in mind. My next question has to do with when you anticipated my next question, which is what decision you think they will take tomorrow. Do you think, given the slowdown in the economy, there is a case for a 50 basis point cut, or do you think 25 is where they should stop?
I think it's worthy of a debate, but I think at the end of the day, I'd land on the side of a 25 basis point cut, because they'll have another meeting in October, another one in December, and if need be, they'll cut it. In all likelihood, they'll cut again at those meetings, and if need be, they could become more aggressive if the labor market does start to go south and a recession does start to ensue. And I do think they are taking a bit of a chance with inflation. I think the logic is, inflation's too high relative to their target. Pick your measure. Inflation measure, it's close to 3%. The target's 2%. And as I said, the direction of travel is for higher inflation. So I think it is reasonable to think that this pickup of inflation will be more a temporary one-off because the tariff hikes will pass through and that'll be the end of the story. That is contingent on stable inflation expectations, and at least in the bond market, those expectations are stable. And that again argues that the inflation that we're going to see here is going to fade away as the tariff effects become less of an issue as we move into next year and towards the end of next year. So I think that makes sense, but it is a risk, and it is possible that inflation expectations pick up. And in fact, consumer inflation expectations have picked up. If you look at surveys done particularly by the University of Michigan, but I think even the New York Fed survey suggests some pickup in inflation expectations, and that would argue that perhaps that the pop to inflation-related tariffs become more persistent. And of course, that's something the Fed desperately wants to avoid. So I think I put a much higher weight on growth and keep cutting, but I don't think I'd do a 50 basis point. I'd go 25 just because of the risks of inflation becoming more entrenched, and also the fact that I've got another bite at the apple here in 6 weeks and another one in 6 weeks after that.
Okay, thanks. I just want to take a question that came in through the chat. Question is, speaking of the threat of a recession, do you think that lowering interest rates would be pushing on a string in the context of the current economy?
No, I think to some degree, the anticipation of these rate cuts, and markets are anticipating a string of rate cuts here, 25 basis points tomorrow, another one in October, another one in December, and that the federal funds rate target will get back to the so-called equilibrium rate, or STAR, where policy is neither supporting or restraining growth, 3% by this time next year. That's kind of embedded in market expectations, and that's already having a benefit, right? One of the reasons why the stock market is at record highs is because investors are pricing in those, those lower rates. So I think we're already getting a benefit. And when rates actually do fall, they do have benefits as well. If you have a credit card, and many low middle income Americans have credit cards, they're paying 20% plus on their card. That rate should come in. That should take some of the pressure off those hard pressed low income households. It helps folks with home equity lines of credit because they're tied to prime. The prime rate's tied to the funds rate. And of course, small businesses, many of them get bank loans at prime, again, tied to the funds rate. And so if the funds rate falls, they'll get a break as well. So, I do think there are benefits to the lower rates. They're already being reflected in financial conditions, the equity market, to some degree, the bond market, and that's already helping. So, no, I don't think it's a pushing on a string. I think it has an impact.
Okay, thank you. My last question for you, Mark, is in macro, I teach, as we do from in textbooks, that a recession is a broad-based decline across all sectors and regions of the economy. But recently it was pointed out to me that you have been talking of a labor recession, and you've said that certain states are in recession. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Why do you draw attention to particular sectors and regions? And do you think this is something that will transmit to the rest of the economy?
Yeah, I call it a jobs recession, Prakash. I thought that was pretty catchy, and it kind of describes it. I mean, job growth has come to a standstill, as I mentioned earlier, and we're starting to get some negative numbers. And I suspect when we get more of the revisions in, we got a sense of that here last week about the benchmark revision, very large downward revision. We'll get some more negative months here. By itself, that's not enough, I think, for the National Bureau of Economic Research, the arbiters of recessions, to actually argue this is a recession, just as long as we have GDP growth and incomes are rising and we're getting positive retail sales. I think we'll avoid an outright economic downturn, but it is a jobs recession. And you can see it in different industries and different regions of the country. And in fact, I did a little bit of work here. I'll do an advertisement. I'm on X at Mark Zaney, did a couple of social media posts on this. I classified industries at a relatively high level of industrial classification in states, economies, as to whether they're in or at risk of recession, whether they're what I call treading water, going nowhere fast, or whether they're expanding. And if you go to industries, you can see it's the good side of the economy that's already in recession. Manufacturing is losing jobs, mining, agriculture, transportation, distribution, wholesaling, they're all losing jobs. The sectors that are adding are healthcare, educational services, a bit of state and local government, a little bit of hospitality, very narrowly concentrated, focused job creation across industry. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics published a so-called diffusion index. What percent of industries covered in the BLS payroll survey, I think it's over 300, are adding to payrolls, and it's less than 50%. And historically, we don't have a lot of history, admittedly, but in the period over which we have data, if it's less than 50% on a 6-month basis, the diffusion index, then that's signals recession. We're always in recession, and we're there. So that's how close we are, and that's why I consider it a jobs recession. Regionally, I did the same thing, at risk or in recession, treading water or expanding. There, the impacts are more ecumenical across the country. It's mostly New England, the Northeast, DC region, obviously because of the DOGE cuts, in parts of the West, the strongest parts of the country and parts of the South. No surprise given immigration flows. But the point of the tweet, and I'll stop, is it kind of shows you how on a razor's edge the economy is between continued expansion and recession. We're very, very close. If you kind of go a little bit more granular and look at the industrial detail or the regional, state level detail.
Okay, we have one more question on the chat. I think all of you may have a view on this. You can jump in if you wish. The question is about whether you expect that AI-related layoffs will significantly affect the labor market, and if so, how soon?
Do you want me to take that, Prakash, or do you want to let others weigh in?
But I was thinking we can also have Tara, who from her Indeed and other related experience, also jump in if she has a view. But yeah, you can start, Mark.
Okay, very quickly, because I've taken a lot of time already, yes, I am expecting AI to have a meaningful impact on the economy, productivity growth, and ultimately on the growth in jobs. And you can kind of sense it already in some of the data. If you look particularly in the tech sector, tech employment is down. And there's this really cool chart that some other researchers put together that showed that the peak in tech employment was the month that ChatGPT was unveiled. I think it was November 2022, something like that. So it's already having an impact, and I expect that to have a meaningful impact going forward. But I will say, and Prakash, I opine about many things. Some things I feel confident in, some not so much. This would be the not so much. But my sense is that AI is going to diffuse through and I'm speaking now as I'm working for a large multinational corporation that's all in on AI. This is going to take time. It's going to diffuse through the economy more slowly to the point where it's going to have labor market effects, but they're going to be manageable. It's not going to be some kind of dystopic wiping out of a lot of jobs and leading to higher unemployment. My sense is that that's just not what's going to happen here. There's too many frictions that make it difficult for it to diffuse. And it's only when new businesses form and optimize around the new technology that you really see the diffusion. Of course, business formation takes time. So it's going to have an impact, but it's going to, in my sense is, my humble view, is that it'll be a manageable impact.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to Joyce Fisher for that question too. Tara, I saw
Prakash,
you
do you want
nodding.
me
Do you
to-
have?
Yeah, do you want me to jump in? I'll just yes and on to what Mark Zandi just said, is that I agree about it being hopefully a slow enough pace that it's going to diffuse through the economy without a dramatic set of layoffs. And I think that's what we're seeing so far, right? We're not seeing a dramatic amount of AI related layoffs, but we are seeing a real cooling in hiring for entry level work. And there is now some evidence that that does seem to be related to AI adoption. And I think that's really an area that several of us on this panel are educators. We do need to think about what that means for preparing our students for the workforce, because they're not going to get that same entry-level training in the same way, because the entry-level work can now be done in many cases, particularly for recent college graduates, by AI. And so I think that is going to change how we think about that. So I think it's going to affect the education sector actually quite a bit. But again, I don't think it's going to be replacing us and resulting in layoffs, but rather creating new and different tasks and new and different ways of thinking about education.
Okay, maybe let's turn to Marvin now. Marvin, so Mark gave the Fed a strong A. Do you give it a strong F?
We'll see what they do this week.
Oh.
But they're definitely on the verge of an F. So look, I think while you wanted to focus on this year, I think context matters. So I am going to take the leeway that you've given and talk about what was the path to get here. It's in the sense of, I think, as you as educators, most of the rest of you on this panel, understand that like early in the semester, you're going to give people more lenient grades because you don't expect that they should have known that by now. But if they keep making the same mistake over and over and over again, you might start to think by the final exam, hey, you should have learned this. I'm going to grade you a bit harder on this. And that's really the way I think about the Fed. The other little context I'd like to throw out there is just because, one of the things I've seen happen since President Trump has come into office and has critiqued the Fed, and his critiques of the Fed, I think, are very different from mine, as will come across, is that there's been this surge to lionize somehow Chairman Powell. And I think it's important to put his record, most of which predates Trump, in context. So if you look back over the last 112 years of the Federal Reserve's history, he has the 7th worst average inflation outcome. Okay. Now, when you think that Paul Volcker is one of the people ahead of him and inherited that inflation, you should probably throw him out. If you think about Eugene Black, Mariner Eccles, Warren Harding, all operating under the gold standard, 2 of them during world wars, one of them with FDR devaluing the dollar relative to gold by 50%, I'm going to throw them out. That makes him the 3rd worst chairman in history. And I'm going to continue to explain why I think that that's been a problem. So let's go back to that problem of are you making the same mistakes over and over again? So if you look at the latest statement of economic projections of the Fed, where FOMC members give their views of what they think various economic variables should be over the near term and also over the long run, what they assign to what is effectively R star, i.e. the neutral real interest rate in the economy, the interest rate that should keep the economy going at par, at pace with stable inflation and stable growth, is about 1%. The highest on the committee is 1.9%. They also seem to think that potential growth is about 1.8%. The highest estimate on the committee is 2.5%. Now let's just confront the facts of the last few years, okay? So in the last few years, real one-year interest rates have averaged 2.25%, actually above 2.25%. So a full 1.25 percentage points above what the median thinks, and a good 0.3%, 0.4% above what even the highest on the committee thinks. That's in the context of GDP growth over that exact same period of 3% annualized real growth, basically almost double what they think is potential. Now, something's wrong here, either their estimate of potential or their estimate of R star, because I'm not aware of any long and variable lags that last that long that the economy should still be doing this well with those kind of real interest rates. So clearly they have a serious problem with understanding where R star is. And I think that's been clear throughout this process. Same thing, let's think about how they've handled inflation over and over and over again. They keep making the same mistake, that if inflation dips a little bit, they say, hey, everything's under control. We can start cutting now. They had it wrong at the beginning of this. That's why they've had one of the worst inflation outcomes in the Federal Reserve's history. I was not one of those stopped watches who thought that inflation was going to come roaring back in the last decade. I was actually one of the earliest ones calling it much lower. And yet in 2020, it was obvious to me it was going to take off. Every single signal was flashing. This is a permanent rise in inflation, and most importantly, inflation expectations. You saw it very clearly in personal inflation expectations, the people who actually make pricing decisions, not bond markets. Bond markets are pretty useless as an indicator. They're a great forecasting tool in normal times. They've actually been terrible when you have any sort of transition in inflation. So those are not what you should be paying attention to for inflation expectations. And yet, time and time again, the Fed keeps making this mistake. So they did this. Their initial sins were in 2020, 2021. They did it again in fall 2023. Remember when they pivoted going into the December 2023 meeting and suggested they were going to start cutting immediately? They had to back off of that. They did the same thing in summer of 2024. Again, they got it wrong. And they had to back, well, they didn't back off it. They actually cut right there. They've had to do the same thing again this spring. Each time inflation has reaccelerated. And at some point, you'd start to think maybe they'd have a little bit of humility and a lot less hubris and start thinking, gosh, maybe we actually don't understand inflation as well as we keep saying that we do. Same thing with inflation expectations. They missed it back then. They missed it again this spring. They're talking about cutting at a time when inflation expectations are falling. Mark raised the inflation expectations of the New York Fed. What I really love about the New York Fed is that they break it down by demographic groups. And one of the things that was a clear signal to me back in 2020 and 2021 that inflation was indeed taking off is the people closest to pricing decisions, that is low education or low education or low wage workers, were the ones who saw their inflation expectations immediately take off. Guess what's happened in the last 2 months? Those guys have taken off again. And you're talking about cutting rates now? Given that in the background, the economy actually is doing very well. I think Mark's expression of a jobless or a jobs recession is at least gives you the context for it, right? That it's really only in the jobs data. Despite all the people saying that indeed we have such tremendous uncertainty, it's going to hold back business fixed investment. We've had some of the best business fixed investment numbers in US history in the first half of this year. And that's, by the way, at a time when the 10-year average investment share of GDP, and I'm talking about CapEx here, is actually at its highest in history, going back multiple decades. We are in the middle of a massive investment boom that is about a transformation in our economy, and that is what has really been driving this growth and the higher R star that they keep missing. And so when I put all those things together, I think, gosh, you should be acting with a lot more caution. So I agree with Mark on that. We should show caution, but caution is not cutting rates 50 basis points last September, which was a clear error. Caution was not continuing to cut after that. Caution is not talking about cutting when you haven't gotten inflation under control, when you have 54 straight months of missing your target. And as I said, one of the worst inflation records in history. And every other signal in the economy is telling you the economy is booming. Retail sales came out today. 9% annualized growth on a 3% on a 3-month over 3-month basis. Doesn't seem like actually the US is doing particularly badly here. And we do have good explanations for why employment growth should have leveled off. Everybody predicted that there was going to be a significant impact on immigration. And lo and behold, if you look at the household report, we have 1.5 million non-native born, foreign-born workers who've exited the labor force. Yeah, of course we're going to have less employment as a result. That's a supply shock, not a demand shock. And the other explanations for why you might have a softness in employment growth amid this are you have a skills mismatch. By the way, interest rates aren't going to solve that one. Or it is this AI thing. And to Tara's point, you can see it in the lower or the youth workers there. All of those things, if you think about it from an economic theory perspective, say our star is even higher and going higher because the marginal product of capital is going up. So when I look at all of this in context, and I think about the fact that they still haven't slimmed down the balance sheet, that they're creating this massive political target for the institution, I would say these guys have completely messed up. I think that they're doing an extraordinarily poor job. And no, it's not, I'm not on Donald Trump's side. I think the rates should be higher. So yeah, I think that should give you pretty clear context as where I sit on grading them. And I think Chat did a pretty good job of putting me on the opposite end of Mark over there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Martin. That was great. I mean, it's really a good learning experience for my students to have two views that are so opposed and have to figure out where they stand. I'm sure they'll give both of you an A for your very clear presentations. So, okay. Marvin, do you have a quick response to what, I mean, one can guess, but do you have a quick response to what they should do tomorrow, the policy meeting?
Well, they definitely should not cut, but I think that they will. I mean, the chairman has very clearly indicated that in his Jackson Hole speech, as well as, Mark points out that markets have actually been pricing even more cuts than what they're saying. And this committee, one of the other sins I feel in my view is that they allow themselves to be led around by markets way too much.
Okay. Well, I'll come back to you, Marvin, for your views on tariffs. Let me go to Jonathan and Tara before we run out of time. So, Jonathan, it's over to you. A or F or somewhere in between?
I'm a harsh grader, and I would give them an A minus. I think it's good to be talking about the question of how we grade them over the last year now. In a year's time, it'll be easy for people to say, I told you so. But I can see two scenarios. There could be a recession, and then we'll say, oh, the Fed was way behind the curve. Or it could be that the economy keeps growing and inflation rises from its current too high level. And then, of course, we can be critical of the Fed. The truth is, they don't know. And so I think they're doing about the right thing. The arguments I see for cutting, which they did a bit towards the end of last year, the labor market. The labor market seems to have taken a turn down in May. I think there's reason to think that the revisions will be negative. Inflation is high, but part of that is from tariffs, which are kind of a tax increase. So there's a good argument for looking through that. And I think rates would still be above most people's, not Marvin's, but most people's estimate of neutral, slightly above that. Or certainly they were last September. But then there are a lot of arguments for caution. Inflation is too high and it's rising. I'd particularly focus on the 5 to 10-year forward Michigan survey. That's something that didn't rise during the pandemic, but has more recently. And I think it's that, in 21, following a period of 30 years of low inflation, people's inflation expectations were pretty anchored. But the experience of the last few years risks unanchoring those. And so inflation expectations remaining anchored can't be taken for granted. About neutral, higher inflation and higher inflation expectations reduce real rates. And so that's another way in which unintended stimulus has been given to the economy. And financial conditions are super accommodative with valuations being through the roof. So two things that I would point to where I would question if maybe the Fed has/will do too much. One is the 50 basis point rate cut last September seemed odd, just in line of its standard practice, when they were just saying rates are a little bit above neutral to cut by 50 basis points. That had me scratching my head. And I think the SEP at the moment, that we'll see another one, of course, tomorrow, but that has the funds rate going to 3.6 at the end of next year. If that's in a context of inflation and inflation expectations above 3, that's a real rate that's barely above 0. I want to just, when talking about the Fed, talk a little bit about things other than just where they're setting the Fed funds rate. One is the framework review. I think, at least with the benefit of hindsight, the 2020 framework was too conditioned to the particular circumstances that they were in. And its average inflation targeting framework, I know it works in MATLAB simulations when you're stuck at the zero lower bound, but it was too complicated. So I think scrapping that, which is effectively what they did, and going back to the previous framework was a good thing. I also think that the Fed did move into things that are outside of its mandate, outside of its statutory remit, and ones that are politically very controversial. Not as much as other central banks, but it did do things like that. And moving out of that, for example, leaving the central bank's working group on climate change, was probably good for defending their independence. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I did want to ask you one question, which is also in the chat, which is about the Fed's performance in forecasting inflation. This was brought up in a recent editorial by Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And as a forecasting expert, I've always been curious what you thought of that inflation miss, that miss in forecasting inflation. There are 300 of us sitting in those buildings, all forecasting inflation, and yet no one raised their hand to say maybe we have it wrong.
Yeah, inflation forecasting is very hard. It's easy to know it after the fact. Obviously, there were people who had a more accurate handle on inflation than others, but I think the idea that we can accurately forecast inflation or growth a year ahead and do so consistently is just unreasonable. It's the nature of the inflation that you get, I don't think that it really came from monetary policy. Monetary policy was too accommodative in late 21, 22. But even if the Fed had given less forward guidance and had lifted off a little earlier, it was, I think, mainly fiscal policy. You see that from the timing of when inflation shot up in spring of 21 and supply shocks.
Okay, thank you. I should have mentioned that that question came from Karan Bhasin, who's my comrade in arms in teaching macro and economic growth. Thanks, Karan. Let's move to our last panelist, Tara Sinclair.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I basically come in kind of in the middle here. I see really valid points from all three of the previous panelists. And I came in wanting to give the Fed a B. I've heard everybody else's arguments. I still feel like B is the right grade here. And so I know it's not nearly as fun or dramatic as going all the way to an F, but I think it is important to recognize that the Fed has done a lot of things right, but they've done some critical things wrong. And both Marvin and Jonathan brought up what happened in September of last year. And I thought it was going to be my hot take, but apparently it's not so hot because both of them feel the same way, that 50 basis point cut, I think was a really bad setup for this September meeting. And of course, they couldn't have known that at the time, but they were training markets to signal that they would freak out at any shift in the labor market and respond way too much to one number. This whole idea of being data dependent, not data point dependent, was just blown out of the water when it comes to the labor market. And given the lessons that the Fed should have learned from how much people hate inflation from 2022 in particular, you would think that they would lean more into that side of their dual mandate until things are just really clear that the labor market is where they need to focus, and or really clear that inflation is coming all the way back to their 2% target. And so it just really seems to me right now that, how do they get from a B to an A? They get that signal back under control to markets that they are not going to be obsessing about small changes in the labor market or continuing that old mandate of trying to address relative shifts in the labor market rather than recognizing that they can only affect the aggregate labor market outcomes. And so it just seems like right now we're right on that precipice of them once again making a persistent mistake, as Marvin highlighted. But at the same time, some of the things that people have said, I do disagree with. That dual mandate is very hard. And as Jonathan pointed out, having to think about what's going on in the labor market when data comes in with a delay and there are mixed signals. And are we looking at some of these, like what's happening with entry-level work? Is that a relative shift in the labor market? Or is that a leading indicator of where the labor market is going? And so the Fed should react to that. That sort of signal is unclear. And I do think that the Fed is trying to navigate that pretty carefully. And so in some sense, they've been given a challenging assignment. So I think it's a little unfair to fail them on the dual mandate side of things. And particularly when you look at other central banks that also did not do well on a single mandate of just inflation. And so, grading them both on the curve relative to their peers, as well as looking at, the challenging assignment that they were given, I still think I would put them at a B.
I was a bit surprised. I thought you would say that the jobs report really was bad and really put us in what Mark has been calling a jobs recession. 22,000. I wanted to fire someone.
Well, so I would call, I'm going to take a spin on Mark's call. So I will call it a jobless expansion rather than a jobs recession. And I think that makes a lot of sense given where we are. And the idea, as Marvin pointed out, we've seen a lot of job gains previously. And if we look at the ratios on the household side of the labor market, if we look at prime age employment to population ratio, still really strong. 4.3% unemployment is only 2/10 above what the Fed thinks of as being really the long run neutral rate of unemployment. So it does not look to me like the labor market is crumbling. I definitely have some concerns about, as I continue to highlight, entry level work and the lack of churn. But as far as I know, I would love to see research on how monetary policy affects churn in the labor market. But my sense is that that is not really something that is clearly in their purview. And I think in some way the Fed, by pulling back on that in its most recent review of their framework, suggests that maybe they recognize as well that they need to focus more on those like aggregate numbers rather than the distribution of jobs in the labor market.
Okay, thanks very much. So there were a couple more questions in the chat that I wanted to pick up. One, I think I see that a student is picking up on something we talked about in class. In class, I of course teach the association between central bank independence and inflation. So the student wants to know, with the attacks that we have seen on central bank independence, does that affect your inflation forecast for the US for the coming years? Or do you think that that's a very small effect?
I think that the attacks are severe enough that I'm afraid it's a very real risk for me that, the idea of setting monetary policy to minimize nominal debt servicing costs is a bizarre one. And yet, if something like that, we can talk about whether the Fed should cut at all tomorrow or 25 basis points or 50 basis points. But if they were to cut to a level that, with a strongish labor market and heightened inflation expectations, just put the real funds rate deep in negative territory, then that's going to be massively inflationary. And there are certainly mistakes that the Fed has made, but I don't want to throw away the idea of an independent central bank.
Let me turn back to Mark, both to respond to what you've heard from the other panelists and to throw in one more question, Mark, which other panelists can also jump in, which is, would you think that the Fed should do anything about developments in the housing sector? Somebody sent me something I've written recently about that you thought that the housing prices might go into a severe decline. Is this something that the Fed should be worried about? Is that one of the sectors that you would highlight as something that the Fed should be concerned about?
Well, let me say a couple things in reaction to the other panelists. All very good comments. I just want to second Jonathan's point about Fed independence. I think that's a massive, huge deal. I think it's script to still be written, so I think it's going to be very telling who the president nominates for the Fed chair. Obviously, Fed Chair Powell rolls off in May of 26, and we're going to get a nominee here pretty soon. I think that's going to be critical. And I do think that could be market moving, depending on who that person is. If bond investors think that that person is going to be captured by the executive branch, I think that's going to be a real problem. So I think that's a big deal. I also want to second Tara's point about the fact that the Federal Reserve, really since the pandemic, it has to adjust policy to massive shocks and massive moves in fiscal policy and economic policy more broadly. It's not just the pandemic. The other thing that people, I think, don't fully appreciate is the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine and the impact that had on inflation. And you can't forecast that. That wasn't even on the radar screen going into 2022. And we had oil prices at record highs. We were paying $5 for a gallon of regular unleaded in June of 2022. That's not on the forecasters. That's not on the Fed. That's just the circumstance. And then this policy, just think about the policy steps, $5 trillion in fiscal support during the pandemic. And then you had 3 major pieces of legislation in the Biden administration. Now you have the one big, beautiful BBB, the big, beautiful bill, massive changes in immigration policy and trade policy. And here's the Fed having to navigate all around that. So I really, you can't give them an A. I mean, it wasn't, we came into the year with the economy at full employment and inflation headed right back to target. We were there. We were on the cusp of victory, and we snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, come on, it feels like a strong A to me. So anyway, maybe I changed Tara's mind. I'm not sure. And then Prakash, you asked a question about the housing market. I think that's outside the purview of the Fed, certainly in the current context. I mean, you could argue when you're in the middle of the pandemic and it feels like the economy's evaporating and you don't know how the pandemic is going to play out. You're at the zero lower bound and you're QEing and you're buying mortgage securities in an effort to, get mortgage rates down to provide some support to housing and the mortgage finance system. That makes sense to me. But in the current context, no. I mean, I think the Fed should be working hard to extricate itself from, from support. It's really a fiscal policy. It's in the purview of fiscal policy. And lawmakers here are, it's a difficult problem because some of it's around zoning and permitting, and federal fiscal policymakers have no control over that. They just really can't have any, it's very difficult to have any impact on that. But there's some things they are doing. And in fact, in the big, beautiful bill, there was an expansion of LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. I know that's much maligned, but I think that's a good step. And here's a plug, another plug. I want to do that. I got an op-ed coming out in the Washington Post on changing the capital gains tax on housing. I think that would be a really good way to kind of unlock the housing market and get things going again to improve affordability and get home ownership moving in the right direction. So I don't think that's in the Fed's kind of remit, certainly not in the current context.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody else want to come in for a last word? Mark, do you have an objection to Tara's characterization of this as a jobless expansion rather than a jobs recession?
I like that. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Marvin. You go ahead, Marvin. Go ahead.
No, I heard Marvin. Bad hearing.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on that one, I love that term. Can I use it?
With appropriate attribution, Marvin.
Of course.
To Johns Hopkins. So, and Mark, do you have any view on whether, the fact that fixed investment has remained strong, as Marvin was saying? Does that change your view of the economy?
No, it has been strong, no doubt about it. I mean, I think a part of that obviously there's three major tailwinds to investment spending. One has been the AI boom, obviously, driving a lot of activity. Two is the legislation passed under President Biden, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, and the infrastructure legislation. Manufacturing facility investment was booming coming into this year because of those policies. And three, front-loaded investment to get ahead of the tariffs that kind of juice things up in the first half of the year with regard to investment. But that has been a more positive part of the economy, no doubt. The real weakness has been consumers. And of course the American consumer drives the train. They're the engine. Investment spending kind of follows along. It's a minor in the grand scheme of things compared to consumer spending. And consumers have impacted in. We got, as Marvin pointed out, retail sales today were pretty good. But if you look at real consumer spending all in, it's basically gone nowhere this year. Flat as a pancake. It's no higher in the month of July, the last data point, than it was back in December. And I think that goes to why we're not in recession, because consumers have impacted in, but why we're so close to recession, because they're treading water. And the other point I'd make is most of the spending, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of the spending is being done by folks in the top part, the very tippity top part of the income distribution. The top 10% of the income distribution, by my calculation, accounts for 50% of all spending. They're the key. And that's positive and negative. Positive because they're in very good financial shape right now, but I do worry that if something like the stock market were to stumble for whatever reason, and those folks turn more cautious in their spending through negative wealth effects, that we're going to have a big problem. So, I wouldn't take exception to what Marvin said about investment spending. I just think the real action, though, is really, it's all about the American consumer when it comes to the business cycle.
Okay. Marvin, looks like we do have time for us to come back to a question that I had wanted to ask you. Many of my students have noticed that you have said somewhat positive things about tariffs. You said that it may unleash a productivity boom. So they have been very curious about that. And I wonder if you could explain to my students why you've taken that view about tariffs, and in general, what do you think the impact of tariffs may be on output and inflation? There was a question in the chat. Let me see if I can pick that up too.
Yeah, there was one.
The question is more about thinking about tariffs, not just the immediate impact, but the longer term impact.
Yeah, no.
Go ahead.
Look, I think let me address the last one first, because I think it's really important, and it gets to some of the issues that were raised by others. Jonathan, in talking about forecasting inflation, and also Mark's comments to some extent. So, yes, inflation is hard to forecast. In fact, somewhat troublingly, inflation for the econometricians in the room actually almost looks like an I-1 series, i.e. it is a random walk, which is a very troubling thing for anybody who thinks you should be able to inflation target, by the way. So I'll just throw that out there. But I'm not going to give the Fed or professional forecasters a very good grade on that, to be perfectly frank. When I mentioned that I wasn't one of those stopwatches who thought that inflation would take off in the last decade, I actually called what I called, quote, missing inflation for that decade. And one of the clues that I was focused on was the persistent bias, forecasting bias of the Fed, almost every central bank, consensus forecasters, the Bloomberg consensus. You go across the board, all of them over-anticipated inflation persistently year after year after year. That's not a forecasting error. That's a problem with your model if you consistently get it the wrong direction, right? Forecast errors are, I get it wrong here, I get it wrong there, whatever. That's not what happened. Same thing in this one. They consistently, you've seen all those charts of people forecasting inflation coming down, and they consistently got it wrong in the other direction. Clearly, they're missing something here. And I think the thing they're missing is inflation expectations. Inflation expectations were very clear. And the problem is that from an econometric standpoint, they don't move much most of the time. So it's really hard to get them to show up in your regressions, right? But if you look at an event study of what happened in 2020 and 2021, it was very clear. Low income and low education inflation expectations took off first. Then it was medium education. Then it was most educated. Then it was bond markets. Then it was central banks. Okay? So basically, the so-called dumb people got it right way before all the so-called smart people. And that's because all the smart people believe in their models instead of what's right in front of their face, which is what the average consumer on the street was facing. And they're the ones who dictate this. And I think this is one of the reasons why economists keep getting it wrong, because they don't pay enough attention to those types of things. Now, to the tariffs thing, this is a classic thing, and I think I'm glad you asked about this for your students. One of the things that I think is a common error that a lot of people make in economics is taking a study off the shelf and saying, see, this study says that tariffs are bad for productivity. And in many cases, they are. That's absolutely true. But you have to actually look at what was the underlying economic context of that study. What were the assumptions being made in it? And most of those studies, if you look at it, take place during the age of hyperglobalization, and they're focused on emerging market economies. And so, yeah, if I open up my economy during that period and allow Western companies to come in and invest lots of capital in me and bring lots of total factor productivity with them, guess what? Your productivity is going to go up a lot. Was that the tariffs, or was that the capital investment and know-how that was brought with it? So that's a real important thing. The other is that there's an assumption that in the background, we're operating in a world that was perfectly laissez-faire to begin with. That's not the case. We know for a fact that China has been investing persistently 2% of GDP in subsidies for capital subsidies for at least the last 15 to 20 years. That, I think, massively undercounts the amount of capital that was directed through the banking system at underpriced interest rates. And we know that China's total factor productivity growth has been negative, i.e. it would have been better to invest anywhere else in the world than China since 2010. Okay, so we're dealing with a very different situation. We have a large sort of gravitational body out there that has massively distorted global capital markets and global goods markets. And putting up tariff barriers against that might not be the worst idea in the world. And I've done personal work connecting China's import penetration into the US, into Germany, into Japan, showing that it was exactly responsible for a decline in manufacturing productivity in those countries as they effectively laid waste to the industries, and you lost learning by doing effects. So one of the things that it would be, I think, is likely to lead to positive productivity effects is those tariff walls will actually lead to regrowth, relearning by doing, and you do get positive productivity growth from that.
Okay, thanks very much. It's 1 o'clock. So this is a perfect time to end. I see that we have 54 participants still. So that's pretty impressive to have held the attention of 50 people for an hour. So thank you all for joining. I think
Thank you.
Mark momentarily, but Mark, are you still in the background?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Marvin.
Thank you.
We may have lost Mark, but I want to thank him as well for joining the panel. I think it was fun to talk to see all of you, old friends, and to have such an interesting discussion. I think that will be really valuable for my students. So thank you again. And I hope to see you again in person or at least virtually. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.